The Cardinal put to us truth and peace, and Sister Susan has reminded that this year's Bishops' Conference statement speaks very much to that. And there is that opportunity to, if you like, unpack that and sink our teeth more into that. To Maeve's reference to and to Kathleen's addressing of the importance of formation, there's an exciting opportunity that will be shared with us this afternoon from Lana Turvey-Collins from Catholic Mission, specifically in the mission space, and a new initiative that's being rolled out in regard and in relation to that. If we could put our hands together to acknowledge and thank Kathleen. Next up, I'd like to invite Professor Sharon Bessell to speak with us and to present to us. Sharon will be addressing children's experiences of poverty in Australia and the changes we need to end child poverty. Sharon is Professor of Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU. She's the Director of the Children's Policy Centre and co-host of Policy Forum Pod, a weekly podcast that brings cutting-edge research and thinking to inform debates on pressing policy challenges. Sharon teaches courses on social policy, poverty reduction, globalisation, global development, children's human rights and gender. Sharon received awards for teaching excellence from ANU in 2016 and 2022. If we could welcome Sharon.
I can control the slides from here. Yeah. Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here. We're really grateful for the opportunity to be part of this conference and to share some of the research, thank you, that we've been doing with children who are growing up in contexts of poverty. So I want to thank Teresa for the beautiful and grateful welcome to country, and I want to acknowledge that we are on unceded lands, and I pay my respects to traditional owners of this beautiful place and to all Indigenous people who are here today. During this research, we've worked and built connections on Yorta Yorta lands, on Lutruwita, Tasmania, on Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands and on Noongar lands. And in all of that work, we're conscious of what we can learn from 65,000 years of understanding about the importance of connecting children to community, to country and to place. So the research that I'm going to talk about is the result of the incredibly hard work of a wonderful and committed team that's worked with me over the past 3 years. And I want to acknowledge their contribution, and I particularly want to acknowledge Dr. Kayla O'Sullivan, who's here today and has made an extraordinary contribution to this work. So the More for Children research project grew out of the conviction that in a very wealthy country we can do more to support all children, and particularly those whose families are struggling and who are struggling themselves. Our aim is to better understand child poverty from a child's standpoint in order to act. We've done this research by working closely and deeply with communities, with children and their families, and through building partnerships of trust. But we've also been very conscious in building those partnerships and trying to identify the ways in which communities can respond to the child poverty that is in their midst, that communities and families can't act to end child poverty alone. We need to understand the drivers of poverty. We need to understand where we need policy change, and we need to understand where we need deep structural transformation. And I want to say a little bit about that today. Over the past 3 years, we've used rights-based child-centred research to collaborate with over 160 children between the ages of 6 and 16, most of them between the ages of 6 and 12, across 4 states and territories. And I should add that when we do this research, we're very conscious of protecting children's confidentiality, and so we invite children to use a research nickname, and we use those research nicknames when we share children's quotes. So please rest assured that the parents of the children whose quotes I'm going to be referring to did not name their children Buffhead or Bananas or Mr Watermelon, nor are 20% of 10-year-old boys called Messi or Ronaldo. These are the names the children chose. So we all know the headline figure. 1 in 6 children under the age of 15 live in income poverty in Australia. In one community that we've been working in, 40%, that's 40%, of children are living in income poverty. But the numbers can mask a lot, and they can mask what it means for children to be growing up in poverty. To reduce and ultimately end child poverty, we need to know what those experiences are like from the perspective of children. We need to understand deeply how poverty impacts on children's lives, how it affects their health, their learning, their play, and their dreams for the future. And we need to know how to respond in ways that are genuinely child-centred. And so that's what this research has been aiming to do. From our research with children, we've developed a child-centred definition of poverty. Poverty is about income, but it's about more. Poverty is the interplay between key material and non-material deprivations, which limit children's choices and experiences now and into the future. It means that children don't have the material basics, that their opportunities are limited, and the crucial relationships or foundational relationships are not in place or are under pressure. Our research shows that poverty has 3 dimensions that are especially important in understanding and responding, and are especially important to children. So to end child poverty, children need to grow up in a context where there is sufficient money and material resources to meet basic needs. But children also need to grow up, excuse me, I was teaching all day yesterday and I've clearly been talking too much. Children also need to grow up in a context where there's adequate access to essential infrastructure and services, because families can't do it all. We need to ensure that there are public goods available for children. Children need meaningful opportunities for connection and to participate. They need to be able to make choices now and into the future, to be healthy and to be able to play and be free from stress, and they need to be able to learn. All of these things are compromised in context of poverty. And importantly, perhaps most importantly for the children that we've worked with, we need to ensure that we protect the relationships that matter most to children. And we need to ensure that social and economic structures and systems support rather than undermine strong and supportive relationships for children. And we currently have systems and policies that are damaging those relationships. But what does each of these dimensions look like for children who are growing up in poverty? What I want to do now is share just a little bit of what we've heard from children. And I would also add that the organisers have very generously put some of our reports on the table, so please feel free to take those reports with you. So growing up in poverty means that children don't have the basics. Children have described to us what it is like to be hungry, not to have a home, to live in a car, a tent or a caravan park, what it's like to be cold, or what it's like not to have electricity, what it's like to miss out on the most basic things. Children talk about the cost of living, which they understand deeply because they experience the impacts daily. And children talk about the things that they can't do because of a lack of money, but also because of exclusion, discrimination and disconnection, and because of the stress that characterises their lives every day. We invite children in the research to write messages to adult decision makers, and one 10-year-old girl decided that she would address her message to the Prime Minister. She wrote, "Please, can you give children with no opportunity some hope?" And this is what we continually heard from children, that poverty undermines not only their experiences today, but their hope for the future. A 10-year-old boy described his fears for the future. He worried about not having a job when he grows up, or he worried about finding a job that will be very low paying and insecure. He worries that he will be homeless again. He worries that his adult life will be as tough as his childhood. And children describe the ways in which poverty puts pressures on relationships because of the pressure and the stress that poverty causes. And parents spoke about these pressures too. Strong, caring, loving relationships can act to buffer children, to protect them. But poverty eats away at those relationships, and we have systems in place that exacerbate those pressures. Not each of these dimensions in and of themselves necessarily indicates poverty, except perhaps the material dimension, which is closely associated with income poverty, which is often how we understand it. But when these dimensions overlap, we can see multidimensional poverty and often very deep poverty. But what is multidimensional poverty like for a child? It feels like pain is in the air and devastation is everywhere. These eloquent and powerful words are not mine. They come from 12-year-old Max, who described what his life is like. Max had experienced homelessness. He was living in a caravan park. When we met him, he had previously been living in a car with his mum and siblings. So what do we need to change? There are many things, but in the time that I've got remaining, I wanted to map out 4. We need, at a minimum, child-inclusive policies. We need to end the policy and services cliff that emerges when children begin primary school, and to recognise that the middle years matter. And we need to build consensus for change, and we need, alongside that change, new narratives about what it is to be in poverty, and some of those new narratives are starting to emerge. We also need to move beyond patching to challenging systems at the macro level. We need to challenge the systems that we know are failing us and are failing our children. And I want to say a little bit about each of these things. So first, to ensuring the policies and services include children and act to reduce and never exacerbate child poverty. The MORE framework that I've just described, the framework built around material basics, opportunities and strong and supportive relationships for every child, in its full detail is designed to provide a means of achieving policies and services that are child inclusive. In our work, we make a distinction between being child inclusive and child-centred, and both are important. Child-centred policies and services place children as the primary focus. They centre children. While child-inclusive policies place children as one focus amongst others. But children in child-inclusive policies are identified as key stakeholders in policy processes and outcomes. Very often we see neither child inclusiveness or child-centredness. We see that children are invisible. Not all policies or services can or perhaps should be child-centred, but all should be child-inclusive. And as I said, very few are. So to touch very briefly on just a couple of practical examples. We all recognise the urgent need to build affordable housing. But we also need to pay attention to the type of housing that we're building and whether or not it's inclusive of children's needs. If we build low-quality housing with no spaces for children to play, no footpaths for them to move safely around their communities, no places for communities to come together, and no services, the essential services that I talked about earlier, will provide roofs over children's heads, but we are likely to entrench experiences of poverty for generations to come. How different might housing developments look if we put aside a profit motivation, but instead were truly child inclusive and aim to build communities that are child inclusive? And to push the agenda even further, what might government benefits for families who are struggling look like if they were child-centred? And I would argue we should be child-centred if we are aiming to support families with children. An obsession that has characterised policy for 3 decades now, with the contribution that parents should make through paid employment and engagement in the workplace. An obsession with control and compliance would give way to care and to recognition of the value of unpaid care, to empathy and to adequate levels of benefits. So child-centredness may bring about positive outcomes for all of us. I just wanted to say now a little bit about what I mentioned around the missing middle. And this is something that's emerged powerfully through our research and through the work of others. Children in middle childhood, that age group between 6 and 12 or 13, is missing out in terms of both policies and services. There's an intense focus on early childhood in policies at state and federal levels, and for very good reasons. The evidence about the importance of investing in and supporting children through the first 2,000 days is unarguable. The National Early Years Strategy is an incredibly important development in our national policy landscape, as is the appointment of a Minister for Early Childhood at the federal level. And we also see a reignition of policy interest in young people as they move towards the end of school and the transition into paid employment. And there have been some really important initiatives around ensuring that we hear the priorities of young people, but that's normally the group aged between about 12 and 25. In the middle, for that group that we've been working with in middle childhood, we have a gaping hole. Of course, we do see a very strong policy focus on school. And while school is crucial to children's lives and experiences now and their possibilities for the future, it's not the entirety of their lives, but we often act as though it is. Moreover, schools are overstretched and can't cope with the multitude of seemingly endless issues and challenges that are cast to them. And what we hear from children is that while school is important, they also want to be part of their communities. So essentially, we have a massive policy cliff around middle childhood, and this can and must be changed. And change is especially important for children whose families are struggling, children who are growing up in contexts of poverty. And we also urgently need new narratives. We need to move away from blaming and shaming individuals and stigmatising some groups and places. And we've seen this play out in many of our policies. We've also seen this play out in media and public narratives. And instead, we need to recognise the structural nature of poverty and the ways in which systems are failing. We are starting to see some important new narratives emerging, and this matters because no child chooses or deserves to live in poverty. And we have in place some policies, as we have for the past 3 decades, that seem to suggest some children deserve no more than poverty. And we see this through the ways in which policies are incredibly punitive and demand compliance from parents. And finally, we need to think about how we can transform systems and structures. This can include changes to our tax and transfer systems to bring about redistribution and a fairer allocation of the resources that we have. It can happen through changes and increases in government benefits for families who are struggling. And it can happen through more child-inclusive or child-centred policies. And these are important reforms, but to some extent, all of this is patching. It's important patching, but it is patching nonetheless. We need to think big and we need to think transformatively. And as I was listening to the speakers earlier today, it struck me that what I'm talking about here is the far-sighted vision that's referred to in the papal letter for the Jubilee. We have dominant systems that prioritise economic growth over all else. And we have systems that are consumptogenic, systems that are based on ever-increasing consumption and built-in obsolescence of essential goods. And as a result, the most vulnerable households gather debt. And the role of the state has been diminished over time. Regulatory frameworks are often criticised because they are acting to prevent greater wealth creation for the minority. And in the 21st century, We have become in the 21st century, what we've seen is greater financialisation of all that has value. The provision of care has become not a commonly shared commitment or a public good, but a source of profit. Alongside this, we have narratives of individual responsibility and individualisation, where individuals are both isolated and held entirely accountable for their own decisions and for making their own lives. Those who cannot make good lives are too often abandoned. Our research and the More for Children framework that comes from it uncovers the shortcomings in local, state and national policies that are often driven by the ideas that have come to dominate our thinking, the ideas that I've just mapped. Our research also uncovers the damaging nature of dominant global systems and the values and interests on which they're built. And while we must take short and medium-term measures to address child poverty, we can't ignore the macro context. We need systems, and we need to reimagine systems whereby growth models prioritise human and planetary health and are designed to serve child-inclusive rather than consumptogenic systems. Rather than increasing household consumption as the driver of growth, our aim needs to become the building of strong social connections where low-income households are supported. The state must have a role in regulation, not to support value extraction by a few, but value creation by and for the many. And the role of the state must be to deliver essential services and to lead narratives that focus on the public good, rather than abandoning individuals to that lonely task of scripting and being held responsible for their own lives in isolation. This task seems to be getting harder and harder. Globally, it seems harder now than it was before January of this year, but we can't step back from the challenge, nor can we step back from the possibilities for change. So in describing the More for Children framework as transformative, our hope is that it helps us to understand poverty from a child's standpoint, but also helps us to understand structures that create child poverty and to understand where we need to patch urgently, where we need policy and systems reform, and where we need genuine transformation. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of our researches, to share what children have told us, and to share with you the possibility and the hope for change. And I'll leave you with a message from Mr. Hippo, who's 10 years old. He says, show kids respect. We can do that by ending child poverty. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. There is a great deal in what we've had presented to us this morning and to take away. There are hard copies of the research that Sharon's just referenced on each of the tables. We do have a little bit of time before caffeine and nicotine. If people have questions or comments, Sharon's very happy to hear them.
Thank you, Sharon. Michelle Ferrara from Catholic Care Wollongong. I am responsible for out-of-home care and early childhood education and care services. Interesting around the policy and inclusion of children's voices in policy development. It always seems, in my view, to fall into the too hard basket, and I'm wondering if you would have any particular thoughts around strategies of how we could best approach that.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because I think we are becoming better and better at the policy level, but generally at identifying ways for young people to be able to engage in informed policies. But as I said, that's the 12 to 25-year age group. And it's that group in middle childhood that are very often lost. What our research has showed really powerfully is those children in that age group have so much to say. I think a lot of the problem is the attitude that we have as we've found very clearly that sitting across a table from a child and asking them questions is the least effective way to find out what's most important for children, but possibly the least effective way to find out from adults what's most important for them too. I think there are some of our methodology papers around the table, but if we can create spaces that are supportive for children, that are often activity-based, and let children engage on their own terms, children have incredibly powerful ideas about what's important to them. And what's been most striking in our research is that children rarely go immediately to needing more toys or needing advice. They go to the importance of relationships. They talk about the care for others. And so I think it is absolutely possible to include children in meaningful ways in very complex conversations, but we need to do it on their terms, not ours. Thanks.
Hello, is it on? Yeah, what you were talking about really hit home, you know, the heart. And I remember when I was 17, by the time I turned 17, I lost both my parents. And even though I had a home, I was in year 12, we're at boarding school, but I remember going home with the headmaster and a sister that took me home. And when I went home, he was my auntie and my uncle, my mum's brother and sister. And we went straight to the funeral parlour. And they said, well, you're almost 18 now. You're 17. And so my mum died on 22nd of March. And yeah, my birthday was on 20th of April, the following month. But the thing that was so, made me so broken was that here is my auntie and my uncle, you know. Lucky I had Sister Anne with me and Brother Erwin, my headmaster. And because they said to me, well, you're almost 18 now. We just walked into the funeral parlour and sat down, and they said, you're almost 18, you have to organise your mother's funeral. So I went from being a teenager to an adult in a split second. And I wanted to know, you know, even though I had a house, I felt like I was in poverty and I had no one. I was on ab study and a scholarship, but I didn't know how to run a household. You know, I lived out of my own room in the house. I wouldn't go anywhere in the house. And but luckily my mum said education is the key to anything. And I got a scholarship to go off to university. But that year, you know, was supposed to be an important year for me in doing my year 12. But it was the hardest I ever experienced. And I never had any support whatsoever. But going through that made me a much stronger person for all walks of life. And I wouldn't want no one else, especially another person that was my age or younger, lose both parents at a crucial time in their life. You know, even though I was, yeah, like I said, I had my own house and that, I didn't really have the comfort of my auntie and uncle that supported me. So I lived off my ab study and then went off to uni to make a better life for myself, which I did. Because my mum always told me education was the key to anything. But yeah, I felt like I was in poverty and I didn't have no one to speak to. And every now and again, it comes back and haunts me, you know, when I see innocent children like that. So, thank you.
Teresa, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think your story speaks so powerfully to why we need to centre relationships as well as what matters in terms of the material basics, because that connection is so important to all of us. I think we often hear in our research about resilience for children, but I think too often children are expected to be too resilient. And we need to make sure we centre relationships to support children. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Perhaps one more.
Good morning. Good morning, and thank you for your presentation. Adrian Middledorp here from Catholic Healthcare. This is not really related to my work, but it's related more as a parent. And I just wanted to ask the question, what has your research uncovered about I would call it the gift of presence? And I guess it goes into the connection part that you're talking about, but it feels though our tax systems, tax incentives, even the early childhood policies that are getting pushed is to take parents away from children. And, you know, I think I would love, you know, I would love the opportunity to spend more time with my children. And I think of people like your single mothers and things like that. I'd just like to know, yeah, I guess that idea of presence specifically.
Thank you so much for the question. And this is so incredibly important. When we talk to children, we always begin by saying, what's good about life? And inevitably, children talk about family and time with parents, or with the people that matter to them. And so this is phenomenally important. In that relational dimension, you know, we're building that out to themes and indicators, both to be able to measure, but also to be able to ideally shape, but at least advocate for policy change. One of the themes sitting within that relational dimension is time with parents. And this is something that is fundamentally important, and we have systems and structures, as you've just outlined, that prevent that and that undermine the importance of time as a resource, and as a resource that children and often parents value most. And so we need, in that transformative thinking, to think about the value of time between children and parents, or children who matter, or people who matter most to them. And I think all of us feel that pressure of time. One of the things that's really striking in our research, but we've also seen through other research and evidence, is that being poor takes an enormous amount of time and takes an enormous amount of resource. You know, and that's because of the compliance that we place on people. And I'm conscious that I'm standing between you and morning tea, so I'll make this very, very brief. But I'll just to give you one example of a mum who described having her Centacare benefit cut. This meant she wasn't going to be able to pay her rent, so she had to spend her entire day on the phone to Centrelink. She finally got through 2:45 in the afternoon and was told she had the wrong number. So she knew she was going to have to again spend that time on the phone. She went to pick up her 5-year-old child. She said he ran up to her, you know, "Mummy, mummy, mummy, guess what happened today?" And her response was, "Can you just be quiet? Mummy's had enough." And 3 weeks later, she was still carrying the guilt from her response to him. Now, part of that was around the devaluing of her time and the fact that she was under so much pressure that she had no more time for her child, even though she was physically present. So there is a whole lot that we can do around compliance and the punitive nature of our benefit system that can shift things, but we also need to think beyond that and actually centre care and time as part of that care.
On everyone's behalf, I'd like to thank Sharon and Kayla, who's here, for their work and for Sharon's presentation this morning. A couple of the things that I particularly took away, there is a sense in the various quotes and things that we heard and saw being reminded out of the mouths of babes. And in particular, the first of those that Sharon presented to us, to please give children with no opportunity some hope. Sharon, to quote her, has provided us an opportunity to think big and think transformatively and to think by and for the many. Thank you, Sharon. Thanks, Aaron. Just to round out this morning and before morning tea, in looking at Sharon and Kayla's research, it struck me these concepts of child poverty around opportunity, material and relationship. We've been reminded this morning about the richness of Pope Francis and predecessor popes, of Catholic social teachings globally and within Australia. And we also have, more broadly, many great theologians and writers from within our tradition, one of which is Gustavo Gutierrez, one of my heroes, who left us in October of last year. He contributed as a philosopher, as a priest, as a theologian, and this seminal work that he wrote in 1973, in particular to liberation theology. And it relates very much to Sharon's work and to poverty and the focus, or one of the focuses of our conferences more generally. He says in relation to poverty, first, material poverty is never good, but an evil to be opposed. It is not simply an occasion for charity, but degrading force that denigrates human dignity in order to be opposed and rejected. Secondly, he says poverty is not a result of laziness or fate, but is due to structural injustices that privilege some while marginalising others. Poverty is not inevitable. Collectively, the poor can organise and facilitate change. And thirdly, he says poverty is a complex reality and not limited to its economic dimension. To be poor is to be insignificant. Poverty means an early and unjust death. So from the work of Sharon and the challenge of Gustavo, I think we carry much to think about, much to consider, much to work on and with, and much to advocate from. We'll break now for morning tea. If we could be back at our chairs and tables by 25 to 12, please. Thanks for the morning.